Ramon.
If you go, yeah, just do Ramon. There he is.
There we go. And here we go.
There you go.
All right.
And he's on the
Perfect time.
Hello.
Hello, Ramon.
Hello.
Hello.
There you are.
How are you?
Yeah, there I am.
All right. So I'm going to do a general introduction here, and then we'll get to our next very distinguished speaker here. So welcome all. This is our second installment in the Digital Global Symposium. Just as sort of some technical details here, we are in a very intimate space. This is called the Digital Commons here at Coastal. So it's a small space. You'll see people kind of coming and going. But it makes for kind of a nice discussion, and of course our projection image to you is of the space entire. This event, which we're very excited about, which is live streaming events all throughout the day, is hosted by the Digital Commons, DCD, and has been organized by AGEP, which is the Arts and Humanities Global Experience Program. And with that, I'm Dr. Jen Boyle, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tripti Pillay, who will do introductions.
Hey, Ramon. So, hi. So before I introduce you, I'll set up the format. Ramon will talk for about 30, 35, 40 minutes, and we'll have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. We'll wrap up a few minutes before the hour to set up the next speaker. So that's essentially the deal. Again, as Dr. Boyle said, it's a casual space, so hopefully you will see several of us, but some of us might come and go. That's no diss.
Okay.
Ramon Amaro, also known as at Samba Rhino, is a lecturer in the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths, University of London. He is also research fellow in digital culture at, and I'm going to mispronounce this, so you should say it, Het Nieuw Institute in Rotterdam.
Perfect.
Okay. And he is tutor in media theory at the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague. His research interests include machine learning, engineering, black ontology, and philosophies of being. Ramon has completed his PhD in philosophy at Goldsmiths, while holding a master's degree in sociological research from the University of Essex and a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. He has worked as assistant editor for the Sage open access journal Big Data and Society, as quality design engineer for General Motors, and as programs manager for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. Ramon's talk today is titled Data, Race, and the Spatiotemporal Order of Black Existence. Thank you, Ramon, for being here, for taking the time. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And thank you for having me. I did notice it's like exactly on time. So I have such respect for that. I have never actually seen a program that has actually been on time. So it's so thank you. But thank you very much for having me, and those of you that are in the room currently. I really appreciate you listening to my voice for the next few minutes. Just to sort of start us off here, I am a fan of sort of excess and interruption. Nice. So I do encourage you, if anyone in the room has any sort of questions or any type of intervention, I would encourage you to just shout out. We are over Skype, so I may not hear you immediately, but just yell in the room. And please feel free to ask your questions or give an intervention, and I'll try to engage with that as much as possible. But I will allow. Would you mind doing me a favor?
Not at all. Tell me what.
Okay, I'm quite wordy, so if you could let me know how I'm doing on time so we can make sure we could save enough time for discussion.
All right, I will start waving wildly, but I will just say something. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Also, thank you for the introduction as well. As Tripti said, my research is a sort of intersection of many different areas of research. Of course, my primary area of research is computational theory. And there I actually speak on the level of the algorithm and on the level of data and in the philosophy of maths. But also what I do is I try to intersect that with Black ontology and specifically ontologies of being. And I try to talk to you a bit more about what I mean by that. But really what my primary focus is to try to think through the ways that the logics of being itself sort of infiltrate themselves into our everyday lives, like how we live our lives, how we interact with our lives, and specifically how we interact with digital culture and computational culture. And it has certain types of implications. So what you're going to hear is sort of a combination of a historical perspective. It'll also be an abstract philosophical perspective, and it'll also be some sort of culmination to a different form and a different methodology to think about the sort of problematics that we have today. But first, I think the important thing for me is the title that I've given you is completely elitist and it's so abstract, right? So you're like, what am I talking about? But there's a very specific reason why I'm contextualizing this talk within that type of title. And I wanted to sort of elaborate and describe that to you at this particular moment. So what I'm adopting in the title, especially the idea of the spatial temporal coordinate, is something that I'm picking up from Kara Keeling, who in her article in the integral Franz Fanon and the Problems of Visual Representation, excuse me, is really trying to think through Fanon to try to think through the contemporary problem of Black existence. So she's sort of returning back to Fanon, as I do similarly. I study Fanon quite in depth. She's trying to return back to Fanon's calculation, his sort of assessment of how colonialism actually operated throughout the world, but not necessarily the operation of colonialism, but more so what impact it actually had on the colonized being. And that's not necessarily specific to the Black being, because what Fanon did across this canon of work is sort of extrapolate that. He used the Black being as a site of beginning to see where the colonial imposition came in, and then he expanded that out into a new type of radical humanism. And basically, he's sort of picking up on different philosophical themes. I don't have time to sort of go into Fanon's entire canon and interaction with traditional forms of philosophy, but I do want to return to sort of a specific part, and this is what Keeling is talking about, the spatial temporal coordinate. Before I sort of describe what that is, for those in the room that aren't familiar with Fanon, I'll just do sort of a brief introduction, just so you can see where we're coming from and the idea of Fanon's sense of, well, what Sylvia Wynter would call this sort of non-being. So Fanon was actually most people don't know this, but Fanon was actually pretty wealthy. He was from Martinique, which at the time was a French colony. He grew up in a pretty good family. He wasn't aristocracy, but I believe his mother was an administrator and his father was a teacher. I think it's the other way around. But he was sent to private school. He was trained on sort of high culture, high French culture. So he was really sort of functioning in the mode of the French elite on Martinique, even though Martinique was primarily Black. So what happened was Fanon at this point considered himself French. He knew he was Martinique French, but he considered France to be his mother country. As the war broke out, Fanon actually, at this point, the Nazis had taken France, so they occupied France. There wasn't much resistance at that time with France. So they've occupied France. So what Fanon actually decided to do was enlist in the French army. There was a certain resistance group that was sanctioned by the British. It was also sanctioned later on by America, but that was a bit later back. But it was sanctioned by the British, and what they would do is it was a formal army corps, but they would go town to town, and basically they would compile the resistance forces against the Nazis. So that was the sort of strategy in France. We sort of know it as D-Day, Liberation Day, but there was a lot going on underneath. So Fanon actually leaves Martinique. He goes and enlists in the French army. And that's where he encounters his first sort of, well, not first, he actually encountered it in Martinique, but he encountered the most significant point of anti-Black racism. So, because what he could not understand was actually that not only were the ranks in the French army segregated by race, and mind you, the French were recruiting from different colonies. So there was a mixture of sort of troops that were engaging with the Nazis. So not only did he notice that it was segregated, but all of a sudden he himself became victims of anti-Black racism. And he could not really reconcile the fact of how he could actually be French. He was French. In his mind, he was a French citizen. And he had subscribed to the customs of the motherland, but actually once he arrived on French soil, he became an other. And it's a significant moment because actually what happened as soon as France was actually liberated, all of the soldiers that came from the colonies were extradited to Toulon, which is south of France. So basically all the soldiers of color after the war was won were sent to the south of France, and then they were deported back to their native lands. And it's that moment where Fanon started to study psychiatry, and he really started to understand sort of the imposition, the racial imposition of being what he calls interpellation, which is that call. It's that call that basically says, I am different, I am the other, and it enacts itself in the everyday mode of operation. So after this moment, what happens with Fanon is he goes back to France, studies psychiatry, encounters more anti-Black racism, and then decides actually to leave France and to go to Algeria, which was a French colony, and enlist in the Algerian War. But this time he did not fight for France, he fought for the Algerian resistance. And at that point, I think he was about 32 years old, no pressure anyone in the room, but he was actually running a psychiatric hospital in Algeria, so most of his patients were actually colonized individuals. And already we're making an implicit connection because we're talking about Algeria, which we don't traditionally associate when we're thinking about the dynamics of race, particularly when we're talking about the North American context. But we're already, even just through Fanon, we're making implicit ties of different types of others in different types of global situations that he's seeing are imposed upon by these certain sets of logics. And these logics themselves are having a detrimental impact on the individuals that are being colonized. And what he's actually critiquing, especially in Black Skin, White Mass, is really what he's saying is that because of this process, one thing that has been established is this idea of the prototypical type of man. I'm using Lewis Gordon's term, the prototypical man. And Sylvia Wynter picks up on this point as well. And what this prototypical man is it was an actual being that was created, obviously coming from the Enlightenment. It's an actual being that's actually created in the Anglo-European form. And we could be explicit here, and it really represents the European heterosexual white male. At this point, it didn't even include the female. So this became the prototypical being. Historically, what Sylvia Wynter would take us through is understanding that during the Renaissance, this historical being, so this white heterosexual male was the pinnacle of species, right? This is prior to eugenics, what we know as a sort of categorization of race. But what happened was that this prototypical man was always tied into the divine. This man was God. After the Renaissance and the sort of break with humanism, sorry, I'm going through a lot of ontological.
No, this is very useful, though. It's very useful, so go ahead.
Right, and this will make sense in why I'm talking about this in relationship to Facebook. But so what happened was after the humanist movement, what happened was there was an explicit separation between the divine and man. So first they were combined together as man as the representative of the divine, and then they separated into the divine and man. And what that meant was, once we started using sort of scientific observation, what we call epistemology, it reinforced the logics of human types of rankings. So what happened is this prototypical man was no longer the divine, but was the closest to the divine. And anything, any sort of being that was categorized underneath that was considered on the other spectrum. So in one spectrum, we have the divine, and in the other spectrum, we had animals. And then the species across the world were ordered and ranked in a hierarchy, some being closer to God, which obviously had to do with skin color, which is what Fanon's picking upon. And those with darker skin color were closer to animals. And especially when we're thinking about this context, which are mostly people from Africa, are considered to be closest to the ape. I mean, that's where the stereotype comes from. So, but because of this particular scientifically reinforced ranking, the actual black being was considered a non-being. It basically was considered an animal. And so this is an important element because what it did was it discursively, within academia, within science, within history, within philosophy, what it actually did was it reinforced all of the colonial actions that preceded that as divine providence. So in other words, to put it plainly, you are not a human anyway, so anything I subject you to actually is the will of God, because if God wanted you to be something else, then you would have been white, heterosexual male, right? That's really how it's systematic. I'm condensing it and reducing the debate. That's really how it's systematically unfolded. So these were the type of, these logics, I would say, were the type of imperial logics that emerged. And they emerged, I guess, starting in about the 17th century and sort of going forward. I mean, we know this as the context of being in Darwin and sort of natural selection and survival of the fittest, but actually that's a bit of a misnomer, because Darwin actually was obsessed with the collection of data. He was obsessed with understanding species and being, but what Darwin never did was he never ranked them. He just observed. So the lion did this to the gazelle, blah, 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 blah. It was actually Darwin's cousin, Galton, who actually is not far from me, one of my sister universities, UCL. They still have this, he actually came from that university. It was the beginning of eugenics. It was him that he adopted Darwin's theories and applied it to the human form as an additional type of justification. So that's where the ideas of this sort of survival of the species, this sort of provenance, that if a particular type of being is of an upper level of species, then it would automatically have the ability to sort of pick itself up and actually emerge as a state of power. I mean, we see these rhetorics mimicked today, don't we? We call it the bootstrap today, right? If that community, you just pick up your bootstraps, they would do it, and if you can't do it, it must be a flaw within the genetic point of your particular type of culture. So these logics emerge from a very long strain. But to return to the idea of the coordinate, I want to think through what Keeling writes and how she describes the coordinate. So she describes the coordinate as that coordinate makes possible colonial discourse, colonial representations, and even colonial reality. And that's a big portion. But it itself eludes representation by colonialism structures. The spatial temporal coordinate at which the Black's inferiority comes into being through the other is colonialism's foundation. So you already have 2 points, right? You have the installation of anything that's made visible is made visible within the prototypical form. And not only that, but it actually becomes the foundation of that prototypical form. So the prototypical form needs to reproduce that situation in order to keep its own prototype. And she goes on to say that its particular spatial coordinates have been obliterated, universalized, and its specific temporal coordinates have become unknowable because Black's inferiority is constantly reinstated. The temporality of the colonial world thus shackles life to the past as a way of rationalizing colonial existence. Now, I want to think a bit broader about the idea of colonialism here. And make a distinction between imperialism and colonialism. Because Alexander Rango does a good treatment on distinguishing both. And we often take those two for granted because we conflate them together. So imperialism, and we hear this in rhetoric, sort of, American imperialism, British imperialism, so on and so forth. Imperialism is the actual logic itself of superiority, hierarchy, and domination. Right? So I am more powerful. I will do this. We see those rhetorics sort of even repeating today. I have the ability to subserve, to put my ideology on top of an existing ideology. Colonialism, the difference between imperialism and colonialism is the inaction of imperialism. So if we think about the rhetorics of, so here in the UK, they're very much steeped in, in imperial type of debates. Obviously, it's an old empire that they're trying to return to, so it's steeped in these types of debates. So there are certain nations where they speak upon the British ideals being in that nation. However, the next step, today we speak in terms of military power. The next step is enacting those logics themselves. They may come in trade deals, they may come in pressuring a sort of certain policy, so on and so forth. So that's how I want to distinguish between colonialism and imperialism. So if we think of the third element to that, which often gets left out of the matrix, which is the idea of slavery. So even the idea of slavery is the enactment of an imperial type of process. The actual process, the mechanism by which someone is unwillfully captured and sold and put into unrewarded labor itself is the enaction of imperial logic. So if we think through the idea of the spatial coordinate, really the connection that I want to build here is the idea of when we think about things such as colonialism and thinking about things such as slavery, it's not just an ideology. It's actually an operational function, like healing says, actually even renders itself invisible. And if we were to put that with Fanon and healing as well, it not only renders itself invisible, but as I said, it has a steep interest in reinforcing itself. But not only does it reinforce itself, but it actually fragments the actual individual that's imposed and in contact with it. That individual is no longer a species, is no longer a being. It actually is a collection of fragmentations that are of use to colonialism itself. And this becomes a particularly important element, especially when we think about the terms of contemporary capitalism. Now, it seems like I'm sort of switching bases here, but it just bear with me and sort of steep in here. So when we think about, really what I'm trying to set up is the conditions for beings to be actually othered. So any form of difference actually emerges from these different types of historical logics, right? So it's already a spatial temporal grid. Because if we're coming from the idea of eugenics, we're coming from colonization, we're coming from slavery, it's sort of an implicit line of this is one side of the other, which is the prototype, and this is the other side of the other, which somehow has to be relegated to some sort of hierarchy, which is underneath that particular prototype. So in a way, it's almost a material type of sorting. And we know this today, right? We see this almost in action, this type of material type of sorting. Any structure any institution that we belong to is difficult to extrapolate the idea of ordering and the power that comes with that type of ordering. Even if we think outside of race, in universities, institutions, corporate institutions, so on and so forth, even your place, your position is nonsensical unless there's a sorting mechanism that goes with it, right? Today we speak in the terms of being a team player, right? Or in terms of management, or in terms of a review, or in terms of, and most of the time, the logics that actually come from these different spatial positions of power themselves, as Keeling says, becomes invisible, right? So even your university has an ethos, right? Where does it come from? No. Right? Even there's a power structure of acceptable modes of behavior. Where does it come from? We don't know. All we know are the people who enact that particular policy. So your manager may enact the ethos of the university, but the manager most likely cannot explain even where the ethos emerges from. Right? And that itself becomes the ubiquity and the power of the spatial temporal logics. Even when we think about functions of time, I mean, that was actually a construction by colonialism, this discretized type of time, and even to have meaning associated with that time. I'm participating in it with you, right? I'm supposed to be here at 4:00 my time. If it's 4:01, then I automatically get a neuroses that I'm being late, and then what do I attach to that? I'm being rude, I'm not being accepted. You see, everything gets attached to this abstraction called time. So to come back to this particular type of context, I really want to bring it back into the idea, because really fundamentally what I'm talking about is the element of the particular. And that's what Fanon is saying. Everyone in the room there is a particular that incorporates all of your identified difference. However, what Fanon is trying to do is make a relationship between that particular and a universal. And that is your spatial temporal position. So if we think even outside of Blackness, even within Blackness, to the idea of difference itself, you can start imagining in your own life how you're actually spatially and temporally positioned in certain places. As a female identified body, as a queer body, heterosexual body, any form of difference that you can imagine, you can see how when you're actually in a relationship with the universal, that becomes your implicit position. Now, I want to kind of diverge for a second to think about how modern forms of capitalism actually function within that relationship. And this is somewhat difficult because most of our conceptions of capitalism are predicated on the fact of what I call an alien imposition. It's very much what I call it. This thing somehow came from space and it's just imposing itself on me, right? It's just there, it's saturating, it's suffocating, but it comes from nowhere. But I want to kind of diverge from that logic a second and look at the actual functions of participation in capitalism actually being a form of spatial temporal organization.
So Ramon, I'm being timekeeper. You have a little over 15 minutes before we open for Q&A.
Okay, I'm gonna blast through this really quickly. Okay, so as we go to capitalism, I think I'm gonna push forward just a second, and why that becomes important, and what I've sort of set up as a foundation earlier is one particular example, and then I'm gonna go to the contemporary really quickly. So one particular example is if we return to the actual ideology of imperialism. Obviously, the slave trade, the Atlantic trade, birthed from that particular type of ideology. What is not well known is I'm picking up on something that Alessandro Rango talks about, and also Ian Bacon, which is the Zong. Does anyone know the Zong, the story of the Zong?
No.
Okay, the Zong was an actual British slave ship, which actually sailed about a half mile from where I live right now. So the Zong was a British slave ship. So obviously the Middle Passage is going, there's slave ships going everywhere at this point. What was significant about the Zong was, and I believe it was around 1781. The Zong had about 470 slave passengers. What happened is there's a point in the Middle Passage in the Atlantic. Obviously, we were wind sailed at this time. There's a point in the Atlantic Passage where there's not a lot of wind. So the Zong was basically stuck. It was just floating in the Atlantic. An illness broke out on the Zong. 17 crewmen died and 50 slaves died of this illness. What happened was, as they were still stuck, the captain of the Zong made a decision. And it was actually cheaper for him to throw the rest of the living slaves overboard than it was to actually finish their trip to Jamaica. So he basically tossed 132 slaves overboard. But this part we know. We know about the gruesome violence of slavery. But what most people don't realize is actually when the captain arrived at the Jamaican coast, he sued the owner of the shipping company back in Britain. He sued the owner to recoup the cost of the slaves that he had killed. And this actually is a pinnacle moment in British history, because what happened was this case went all the way up to the British Supreme Court. And what it became was, it was the first case to kind of by law actually ask the question of, is the black being an actual being? Right? Can they actually be recouped for capitalism, for capital? And what happened was this incident was actually what birthed the British anti-slavery movement. It was abolished because of this case. But what's interesting is the debates themselves moved away from the genocide, which was, the massacre, which was throwing these slaves over, and the debate became about, can a certain being be treated as property itself? And the answer was yes. Mm-hmm. And so what emerged from that moment was the birth of the insurance industry. Mm-hmm. And so anyone in this room, if you've ever had insurance, car insurance, house insurance, rental insurance, any insurance comes from the black body, because this is what emerged insurance. And so what became more lucrative was not so much selling the slaves with the destination, but actually the insurance that they would make in their life. So already, and the reason why I make this point is, already we see this collision of not only the black body being non-being, but we see this collision of the black body only being a being if it can be capitalized upon. So if it can survive, then it's worth shipping. If it cannot survive, then actually just kill the slave before they even get on board. And why that's particularly important, I don't have much time, so I'm going to kind of jump to the end here, is when I think about the logics underneath this idea. One is spatial temporal organization. One is creating, actually producing difference. Two is subsuming that difference into a universal idea of both a prototype and also a universal idea of capitalism. And what that leads me to are the pervasive logics of digital culture itself. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of research to make that giant leap, but I don't have time to get there, right? So I'm just going to make the leap.
You could send us information and we'll link to it if you want.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
So really what I want to say, I don't have time to sort of go on the level of the algorithm to how even what we know now as our data, or how our data is actually extracted from our lives, but it works under the same types of logics. You know, despite our common misconception, you know, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, whatever, they're not interested in us. No, we're narcissistic. They don't care about us. They care about the fragmentation of us that's of use to its capital model, mm-hmm. which is why you get those annoying ads. They only want the part of you that likes cats. Mm-hmm. They don't care about the rest of you until that. If you happen to like bicycles as well, they want that part of you that likes bicycles, right? So this is the misnomer, especially within computer science communities, and debates in data politics, is thinking about the idea of the algorithm fragmenting us into some abstract land and then sort of commodifying us to make money. But actually, what I argue is we are already pre-fragmented. Mm-hmm. And we're already preconditioned to be subsumed into that particular type of system. So while this becomes particularly important, so when we think about mechanisms of data politics, especially data ethics, and we think about the level of the algorithm and how racism itself actually gets mediated through the algorithm. Mm-hmm. And I have to make a side note that algorithms aren't racist. They're not. Algorithms are math. And I'll show you actually what this is. Now bear with me, because everyone hates that statement. And I'll tell you why. All an algorithm is a step-by-step instructions of symbolic mathematics, the same mathematics that you took in high school, calculus. So right now, everyone in the room, I want you to go back to your old calculus book, whether you hated math or not. Go back to your old calculus book. Just remember an equation in that book and think about it. Is that book misogynist? Is it racist? No, it's just a bunch of confusing symbols. What makes an algorithm racist is the enactment of that algorithm to actually spatially and temporally segregate certain populations. So what's happening is, when Google Maps associates, when President Obama was in the White House, when Google Maps associates the N-word with President Obama, it's not Google who's doing that. It's not even their algorithm. They don't even truly understand what the algorithm is. What it is the particular association of the N-word to that man. And that association is produced by the enactment of our racist logics in concert with the technological tools to make it happen. So the algorithm actually becomes racist because we train it to become racist. We train it to interact in those particular types of modes. I can show you the math and how it happens. It's pretty simple. But it's a particular type of moment to sort of think about the pliability of how this particular issue can happen. And what it does is it re-articulates the way that we engage with digital culture, especially if we're thinking about the functions of Black resistance, if we're thinking about the functions of breaking free from these impositions of racism and impositions of so on and so forth. My argument is that our target is in the wrong place. Because right now, our target, we're fighting math. When we really should be fighting the implications of the logics of making use of these mechanisms and tools to reinstate itself, as Keeling is saying, right? It is invisible. It's operating on an invisible level to reinstate itself as a spatial temporal prototype of being. And what I argue throughout my research is how, in place of the divine, now we have this thing called the ubiquity of the internet. We have this thing called digital culture, the algorithm, machine learning, that has now replaced the eye of God. Right? It's all knowing, it's all seeing, it sees everything. It has the ability to control, to manipulate, to create. And that's how we begin to view this. I mean, that's how Silicon Valley views it, right? That's how we view this. But what's underneath this particular type of element is there's always a certain resistive element. Because sorry, I'm really rushing here. If we are to return to the fact that the real fact of the algorithmic logic, which is a step-by-step function of math, what it does is, for me, it's the first time in history that it actually gives an opportunity for a breach in the colonial logics. And the reason why that is, okay, so everyone close their eyes. Imagine going back to your calculus class, right? Okay, how many people were in your calculus class? 30, 40?
Mine was like 75.
75. Weren't you all learning the same technique?
Yeah. We will.
So,
yes.
Now your comprehension was different.
Right.
But you actually learned the same technique.
Yes.
Machine learning works the same way. The same algorithms that the NSA uses are the same coding libraries that are available to Black Lives Matter. They're the same coding libraries that are available to North Korea. They're the same coding libraries that are available to the university. Mm-hmm. It's the actual comprehension and enactment of those algorithms. And right now, the only people really enacting them are the traditional forms of power. Mm-hmm. That's why it seems as if, that's what I'm saying. That's why it seems as if the algorithm, because it's basically the modern gun. So what's at stake if we really can see this idea of being, and we can see this idea of the particular and this idea of difference, and understanding that we're already preconditioned for the possibility to be manipulated by these particular things. I mean, we see Cambridge Analytica now at this sort of type of debate and being primed for this type of manipulation. But what it also says is that there is a potentiality within there. There is a possibility in there to modulate, to self-modulate in between that particular and that universal. And really what makes it, I guess, particularly frustrating at this point is we have not encountered these types of tools before. We have not encountered the potentiality of these types of technologies. And I don't have time to go into neural nets and how they actually operate, especially generative algorithms. But one important thing to understand is because we have not encountered these types of mechanisms, we do ourselves a disservice by prescribing the result before it even happens. And because we can't prescribe it, it gives us an opportunity to intercept power. It gives us an opportunity to insert representation, and also gives us an opportunity to break representation, because the illusion is that it's already prescriptive. But in fact, it's not prescriptive, because even Google and Facebook, so on and so forth, using advanced neural nets, cannot actually articulate what the outcome will be, which is why they're always retrospective. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg was just in the Senate, right? And he always looks clueless, like he doesn't know what's going on. That's because they don't. Not because they're not skilled computer scientists, not because they're not skilled at algorithmic culture. They don't know what's going on because there's a computational logic that one mimics cultural logics, but also is producing its own logics. So there was no way Facebook could preempt fake news. Because fake news did not emerge culturally until we created it. So it's interpreting it. And it's interpreting it retrospectively. But however, the logics of Silicon Valley is that it's all under control. We know what's going to happen. We know what it's going to do. When in fact, we really don't know fundamentally when we think on the level of computational contingency. Now, I'm going to stop here because we need time for questions. But I wish I could sort of give you the sort of connection there. But it does go back to the idea of what potential lies in actually being an abstraction itself. Because if power is actually relying upon abstraction to initiate other forms of power, then what I'm starting to question is what affirmative potential, especially for Black being, is there in being an abstraction? Right? What actually potential actually lies in the Black being, or even the being of difference, to actually be able to self-modulate between being a particular type of body and then extrapolating yourself into an abstraction that's no longer visible, right? So when you need this particular incident to happen, and what I'm predicating this on is the current move by government, companies, administration to go to a machine learning process. They're relying on the machine to actually make the decisional point. So if you're relying on the machine to make a decisional point, then what possibility lies for me to actually convince the machine that I'm not visible? Right. And we see these modes. They've been happening for years in the global South, mainly in Tunisia, in Egypt, where you have resistance groups who they know how the algorithmic functions of militarized weapons work, mostly militarized drones and facial recognition. And so they spend a lot of time sort of tricking the facial recognition. So they're experimenting with different types of makeup. So where the camera can't recognize their face, or they have different types of haircuts where the camera gets confused and doesn't know it's them. Or they have a strategy, kind of like a Black Lives Matter strategy, as it used to be, where it's decentralized, where one day you're the leader, the next day you're the leader, the next day you have this, so on and so forth. And what it does is what they're doing is they're putting a counter logic within the technology they're using the strength of the technology against the technology. But they're not, so the technology itself is almost like a water hose. It's just a conduit, which is sort of filtering both senses of power. And there are many such examples of this, but I'm going to kind of stop.
Yes.
I'm going to kind of stop there.
Yes, thank you. If anyone has questions, we have about a little less than 10 minutes, but...
Yeah. Sorry, I threw a lot at you.
It is a lot, but you are talking about something which has a sort of complex history. So to simplify it and to flatten out that history in some ways propagates our idea of the invisible powers, right? So I think that's why it was very important for you to contextualize it.
Absolutely.
So questions, comments, thoughts? Tori has run away somewhere, but I'm sure she was like vigorously and noisily taking notes behind my ear.
I'll pose a question because we work with this in theory. We're going to be taking theory in the fall, and we read Fanon with Black Lives Matter. We read them in conjunction with one another, and some really amazing stuff comes out of that. And so this is I don't know if I can pose this question without kind of getting too caught up in my own sort of, but there's the kind of more visible intervention that's still based in these logics that you're pointing to, for example, the hashtag, right? The hashtag is this kind of visible production of these environments, right, that has its own intervention in a kind of way, right? And then we could talk about something like databases. So there's various kinds of databases, and I'm really interested right now in this idea that object-oriented databases, which we don't use anymore because they're very unstable, right? They retrieve information in a way very different from the kinds of databases that we use. That kind of pliability, that was a term you used, the randomness of that, the fact that the glitch and the error can occur in that one version of the database versus the other, is also a kind of intervention, right?
Absolutely.
But they're different. And I was wondering if you could talk about the differences between those two.
Yeah, I think that's, that's one of the things that attracts me to being kind of a Fanonian, because, he was a Galilean. Du Bois did the same thing, but we also sort of circumvented. But because Fanon is trying to make, he's really in this middle zone, sort of as Gloria Anzaldúa would say, this borderland.
Right.
Where he's actually associating these particular modes of power, these very situated modes of power, and how they actually are in relationship to even more universal modes of power. And even those universal modes of power are in relationship to other specific modes of power. So he's actually, in my sense, he's building the first network.
Yep.
Yep. And seeing how this kind of mind map to see how these powers sort of go together. And so exactly what you're saying, is something that, I totally agree with that. And I think that because we're so focused on condensing the computational culture into sort of one alien being, we miss out on the nuances that you're picking up, which is actually these particular functions within computation are operating at different spatial and temporal. They have different spatial and temporal modes of operation, and themselves have different modes of power. But even, I think for me, the affirmative part in that, and I think this is just my sort of mechanical engineering background, is knowing that actually when you make a compilation of individual components into one component, each one of those components has a measure of error.
Yeah.
And that measure of error gets multiplied as those components get pieced together.
Yeah.
So actually, even as a unit, it becomes more fragile than it is as a particular.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I'm thinking about the possibility of resistance. I'm thinking about the possibility of a resistance that can enact itself on every level of the spectrum.
Yeah, there's compounded. Yeah.
And that becomes compounded. So where it no longer becomes about, okay, I need to add up all the error and then attack it. Mm-hmm. Then it becomes about almost a very cell type of structure. So I can resist the sort of power dynamics within the hashtag, and simultaneously I can coordinate with another particular that's resisting the idea of the control mechanisms in the database.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that itself, I think I think that's what Fanon picked up in Algeria, because it was the only way they could operate. But that's kind of where I'm coming from that. And that's why I resist the type of data politics where it's just this kind of us versus them.
Yep.
Because it's way more nuanced and complicated with that. I know this sounds very axiomatic, but I am convinced that if Silicon Valley were run by a different culture of people, it would be our computational culture would express itself differently.
Yep.
So that it's also that dynamic which is infused upon those other types of dynamics.
Yeah.
So.
That's a great response. We have time for one more question. Anybody?
Anything?
Well, okay. I will ask one now. I just sound short. The so what occurs to me is there's this sort of strategic radical invisibility, right? As let's call it guerrilla invisibility, right? So there's active practices and multiple ways in which invisibility can become dangerous. But there is also the other invisibility of the prototype, right? The proto-human, which allows. I mean, it's a deeply privileged place where somebody does not recognize themselves as visible, right? To the rest of the world, they just see themselves as quote unquote, I'm just a human being, right? So I'm thinking about how is it possible to to invert, do you think, is it possible to invert both kinds of invisibilities and have them construct, say, radical visibilities? So knowledge formations in classes, we always say only those people who think or who are privileged enough to think that they are talking common sense or that everybody is represented in their voice can act like they're just nobody, everybody at the same time. But can we make this more visible insofar as your work goes? So instead of thinking of radical invisibility, can you think of radical visibilities?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think there's several functions to do that. I mean, even strategically, just personally, strategically, that's why I'm in theory and ontology, because I sort of follow Sylvia Winter and Denise da Silva, which is because throughout my research, what I recognize, a lot of the impositions that we know today were birthed in philosophy, our education policy, our financial policy. These people actually read philosophy.
Right.
To come up with these ideas. So my mode of resistance is in the philosophical space, but what makes it sort of similar to Winter and da Silva, by the way, caveat, not even associating with their brilliance, but
you should own it, Ramon.
But what makes it significant is they're returning back to ontology, like Fanon. So they're actually trying to re-articulate a different type of ontological narrative. And how that enacts itself for me especially in my classrooms. So there's a big push in Europe right now, especially in the UK and Holland in particular, in the Netherlands, to sort of, they call it decolonizing the syllabus.
Right.
And so me and my colleagues, we have kind of a network, and so what we do is we try to enact decolonizing the syllabus within the classroom to decenter the prototype. So what I do is if I'm teaching a lecture that week on, let's say, race, capitalism, and photography, whatever. Actually, let's take race out of it. Even if I have taught a course without race, if I'm teaching a course on, let's say, photography and time, my automatic mode is I have to find someone to speak on that is outside of the prototype.
Yeah.
So it's either a female-identified body, it's a body of color, it's a body from the global south, and then I bring in the old canon.
Yeah.
Nice.
So basically, I invert the whole thing. I mean, one of my colleagues, she has a pretty aggressive strategy, and she says, she's Dutch, and she just says, I refuse to use, in any of my classes, I refuse to use any European white male. So she can't use Hegel, she can't use Heidegger.
That's a lot of people she
Kant,
can't
right?
use.
And
right.
so she has to use other types of ontology. Right. And then what it becomes is, for the student body, what we're noticing is what it becomes is it decenters the prototype itself. And even the body, and you can actually see this, we talk about this all the time, you can actually see it physically happen in the classroom where the bodies of different start to come forward. Because their representation is actually the centered representation,
right.
but then it's also work to sort of make sure that it's also inclusive of everyone that's in the room. But it does become a very uncomfortable position, as you're saying, because some people don't realize that they are centered.
Right.
So yeah,
I'm going to have to stop you now, Ramon. But you were fabulous, as always. Your brilliance. is formidable.
Just as a closing remark, we're going to be archiving these. So this is an invitation in addition to this marvelous conversation and background that we just received here. If you have additional materials you'd like to go with this video, please send them along, because we're going to curate those, and whatever you'd like to send along, please do.
Oh, that'd be great.
And I will email you soon.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. Good luck,
Take care
everyone.
of yourself.
Thank you.
Bye. I'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, and we